Before continuing, if you enjoy true stories shrouded in mystery, dark human decisions, and places that hide disturbing truths, subscribe to the channel now. Your support allows more stories like this to continue being told. The letter arrived in a thick envelope with yellowed paper and the stamp of a law firm in San Jose, California. The name of Ethan Holloway, it was handwritten in faded blue ink, as if whoever signed it feared using something more modern. Ethan held the envelope for a few seconds before opening it. He didn't recognize the sender, but he recognized the symbolic weight of that surname that appeared at the bottom. Winchester Estate. He never spoke of his maternal family. His mother had died young, taking with her any explanation of the distant kinship with the Winchesters, a name shrouded in whispered stories, rumors of fortune, and a reputation that mixed eccentricity, isolation, and decadence. For Ethan, the Winchesters had always been an uncomfortable footnote, something not investigated so as not to raise questions that might have no answer. The letter's content was straightforward. A will had been reopened after the death of the last recognized legal heir. As a third-degree relative, Ethan had been summoned to the former estate for a supplementary reading of pending clauses. The inheritance was not guaranteed. On the contrary, the text made a point of emphasizing that his presence was mandatory for the conclusion of the process. Ethan was not in a good place. In debt, recently fired from an accounting firm in Chicago, and with a marriage quietly dissolved, he saw in that invitation a practical possibility, not a promise. There was no expectation of wealth, only the hope that this trip could mean some kind of financial fresh start. The Winchester property wasn't exactly in San Jose. It was secluded, surrounded by land that had been swallowed up by urban sprawl, but which still retained a strange air of isolation, as if the place had resisted time through sheer stubbornness. As he approached, Ethan realized that the house didn't stand out for its height, but for its irregularity. No line seemed to follow a logical pattern. Windows appeared where they shouldn't. Doors were positioned at disconcerting angles. The construction seemed the result of unplanned additions, as if each decision had been made in moments of urgency or fear. The lawyer in charge, Charles Whitmore. He was waiting at the entrance, a thin man with a rigid posture, whose expression conveyed more weariness than cordiality. There was no prolonged handshake, no words of welcome, just a brief gesture indicating that Ethan should enter. The interior of the house intensified the feeling of unease. Narrow corridors connected to wide halls without any transition. Staircases ended in closed ceilings. Doors opened onto walls. Everything seemed functional and useless at the same time. Ethan quickly realized that this architecture was not the result of aesthetic eccentricity, but of something more obsessive. As they walked, Whitmore explained that the Winchester family had, over the decades, imposed a series of unusual clauses in their wills. No heir received full ownership of the property without fulfilling specific requirements, many of which were never fully clarified. Some gave up. Others went financially insane trying to keep the place. Few stayed long enough to understand the true weight of the inheritance. Ethan didn't interrupt. He observed marks on the floor, as if heavy furniture had been dragged repeatedly, always along the same paths. There was a persistent smell of old wood mixed with something metallic, almost imperceptible but constant. The reading of the document took place in a secluded room, illuminated by a single narrow window. The text detailed the conditional transfer of the inheritance. The house, the remaining land, and the funds earmarked for the property's upkeep. However, there was a final clause that Whitmore read with visible reluctance. Ethan should reside. The tenant must remain in the property for a specified minimum period, maintaining the structure in working order and carrying out specific repairs as described in previous technical documents. Absence or voluntary abandonment would result in the immediate loss of all rights. More unsettling than the demands themselves was the attached history. Records from previous heirs showed disturbing patterns. Deaths classified as accidents, unexplained bankruptcies, unsolved disappearances, all linked to attempts to fulfill the same clauses. Whitmore ended the reading without offering any interpretations. He simply stated that Ethan's decision had to be made right then and there. There would be no extension. Looking again at the winding corridors of the house, Ethan felt something that wasn't fear, but a silent pressure, as if the place reacted to his presence. There were no voices, no inexplicable shadows, just the concrete feeling that this inheritance wasn't a prize, it was a test, and without fully understanding why, Ethan accepted. Ethan settled into one of the few rooms that seemed minimally habitable. The room was on the second floor, away from the oldest wing of the house, following Charles Whitmore's clear instructions before he left. There were no safety recommendations, only the handing over of a bundle of old keys, all without clear identification. Whitmore left that same day, as if prolonging his stay in that place would be too calculated a risk, even for someone accustomed to strange wills. In the early days, Ethan tried to treat the house as a technical problem. He created a rigid routine, waking up early, mapping corridors, identifying off-limits areas in the will's annexes, recording structural damage. He believed that transforming the space into something measurable would reduce the constant discomfort he felt when moving through the rooms. On paper, the house was just an old and poorly planned construction. In practice, it seemed to react to human presence. The silence was absolute, but not tranquil. It wasn't the kind of quiet common to empty houses. It was a heavy, dense silence, interrupted only by creaks in the wood and drafts of air that arose without a clear origin. Ethan noticed that certain hallways were always colder, regardless of the time of day. Others seemed to absorb the sound of footsteps, creating the strange sensation of walking without making any noise at all. During an inspection of the ground floor, he found a set of documents stored in a built-in cabinet behind a false door. They were old Winchester family records, house plans, construction contracts, letters exchanged between family members and engineers over decades. The pattern began to emerge with unsettling clarity. The house had never been finished. Each heir added, removed, or altered structures according to vague instructions left by the previous one. There was no final design, only an endless sequence of corrections. Among the documents, one name appeared frequently: Sarah Winchester. The letters attributed to her contained no delusions or explicit supernatural references. On the contrary, they were pragmatic, almost cold. They spoke of deadlines, costs, precise instructions to build without stopping. There was no mention of ghosts, curses, or divine punishments, only the obsessive insistence that the work never cease. This realization bothered Ethan more than any legend. If there was no declared superstition, what justified decades of such irrational architectural decisions? The first external contact occurred when Margaret Collins, a local historian, she showed up unannounced. She claimed to be conducting research on neglected historical sites in California. Her interest in the Winchester property was long-standing, but always thwarted by lawyers and temporary heirs. Upon learning of the arrival of a new owner, she decided to try again. Margaret showed no fear of the house. She moved through the rooms with clinical curiosity, observing details that Ethan had ignored. She pointed out marks on the walls indicating old door removals, hasty alterations, and staircases that had been repositioned more than once. According to her, there were municipal records of unfinished building permit applications, many signed by different legal representatives, but always linked to the same family financial fund. She also brought forth less documented information. She commented on heirs who completely isolated themselves during the time they lived there. People who cut off contact with family members, abandoned careers, and disappeared socially before leaving the house, alive or dead. There were no official records of violence, only a succession of personal breakdowns. The antagonism didn't come from a specific person, but from the inherited structure itself. The house required constant maintenance. The funds existed, but were tied to rigorous reports. Every failure generated automatic notifications from lawyers and administrative boards made up of people who never showed up in person. Ethan realized he hadn't just inherited a property, but a legal machine created to keep someone permanently trapped in that place. At night, he began to notice unsettling patterns. Doors that remained open during the day would appear closed in the morning. Tools left in one room would appear in another, always within the area permitted by the will. Nothing disappeared permanently. Everything was moved, as if the house were silently reorganizing the space. Ethan didn't talk about it with Margaret. He merely listened to her historical analyses while trying to keep the rational narrative intact. Still, one conclusion was imposing itself with increasing force. The Winchester legacy didn't test courage or sanity. It tested permanence, the ability to remain there despite the progressive wear and tear, the loss of external references, and the constant feeling that every decision had already been made before he arrived. And slowly, Ethan began to understand that he didn't know the house. He was being integrated to her. Ethan's routine began to unravel in the second week. The initial plan to catalogue, repair and maintain the house clashed with a more unstable reality. No alteration remained exactly as he left it. It wasn't new damage, but subtle adjustments. A reinforced beam seemed out of place the next day. A lubricated door would creak again. Nothing that could be proven sabotage, but enough to generate constant doubts about his own attention to detail. Ethan began working longer hours, believing the problem was fatigue. He slept little, always with the feeling that he needed to finish something urgent, although he didn't know exactly what. The annexes to the will specified areas that required weekly inspections, but upon revisiting the documents, he noticed something unsettling. Some pages didn't match those he had read initially. Dates seemed updated. Cross-references appeared without explanation. The legal content remained valid, but the form changed. The first direct conflict occurred when Ethan tried to isolate an entire wing of the house. An old hallway full of false doors and useless staircases consumed resources without offering any functionality. Technically, he could seal off the area, reduce costs, and meet the minimum requirements of the will. He executed the plan precisely, sealing off access points and documenting everything with photos and reports. The following morning, he found the hallway open. The seals were intact, the locks hadn't been forced, and yet access was unrestricted. More disturbingly, the digital reports he had submitted the previous night contained inconsistencies. Duplicate photos, swapped dates, fields automatically filled with notes he didn't remember writing. The legal system reacted immediately, sending notices of non-compliance and threatening financial penalties if the unauthorized structural adjustments continued. Margaret noticed the change in Ethan's behavior even before he said anything. He was more rigid, less willing to discuss historical hypotheses, obsessed with proving that the house didn't actively interfere in his decisions. When he finally recounted what had happened, she showed no surprise. She simply asked to see the old documents again. It was then that Margaret pointed out a crucial detail. Family records indicated that attempts at simplification always preceded critical events. Heirs who sought to make the house functional, logical, or economically viable faced rapid collapses, financial, psychological, or social. Those who simply maintained the continuous flow of construction without questioning its purpose lasted longer. This revelation brought no relief. It brought an ethical conflict. Staying there required abandoning the professional logic that defined Ethan. As an accountant, his role had always been to optimize, cut excesses, impose order. The Winchester house demanded exactly the opposite, maintaining waste, accepting inconsistency, continuity without an end goal. Tensions rose when former business partners began contacting him. His name had surfaced in connection with unexpected financial disputes, linked to old accounts he was sure he had already settled. Small amounts at first, but recurring. Always associated with legal documents drafted with the same formal structure as Winchester contracts, as if the legal model of inheritance were extending beyond the property itself. Ethan tried to leave the house for a few days, claiming he needed to deal with personal matters. He formalized the request following the established protocol. The response came within a few hours. The temporary absence would imply an immediate review of the stay clause. It wasn't an explicit prohibition, but a clear warning that any absence would weaken his legal position. That night, the house seemed more active. Drafts swept through specific hallways, pushing open doors that had previously remained motionless. The sound of footsteps emerged from empty floors, not as something threatening, but as a constant reminder of presence. Ethan began to move around with a tape recorder running, trying to capture any objective evidence. The recordings, when played back, contained only static noise and stretches of prolonged silence, as if the sound had been selectively removed. The central conflict definitively crystallized when Ethan realized his decisions were being anticipated. Even before planning a structural intervention, preventative notifications would appear, instructing him to keep certain areas active. The house wasn't reacting to his actions, it was anticipating them. Margaret suggested that he not confront the system directly. According to her, the Winchester legacy did not punish immediate disobedience, but rather control. Those who attempted to gain full control over the space were slowly isolated, financially pressured, and emotionally worn down until they gave up or failed. Ethan found himself caught between two incompatible forces, his need to understand and the house's demand to be maintained without any understanding. There was no visible villain, no direct threat, only an ancient, efficient, and patient mechanism designed to transform heirs into functional extensions of the structure itself. By the end of that week, Ethan was no longer thinking about how long he would remain there. He was only thinking about how to avoid provoking the next reaction. And this, he realized with growing unease, meant that the conflict had already been won, just not by him. The first subplot took shape when Ethan realized that the house isolated him not only physically, but also socially. Connections with old friends became brief and uncomfortable. Conversations were interrupted by inexplicable noises on the line, followed by prolonged silences that led the other party to end the call. Messages sent through apps arrived late or disappeared without a trace. Gradually, external contact was reduced to strictly functional communications, almost always related to the maintenance of the property. Meanwhile, Margaret deepened her research. She found records of a little-mentioned heir, Thomas Winchester, who had taken over the house at the beginning of the 20th century for a short period. Unlike the others, Thomas did not try to reorganize the structure or expand it. He dedicated himself to documenting patterns, times when certain areas demanded attention, frequency of recurring repairs, sectors that seemed to react negatively to neglect. His notebooks did not speak of fear or madness, but of adaptation. These records revealed something unsettling. The house functioned best when treated as a living system, not as a building. Thomas described predictable, almost organic cycles of wear and tear. When these cycles were respected, conflicts diminished. When ignored, simultaneous failures arose in distinct areas, as if the structure compensated for one absence with an overload elsewhere. Ethan tried to apply this logic. He began to follow the patterns observed in the documents, keeping projects in progress even without real need. In the short term, the environment seemed to stabilize. Legal notices ceased and documentary inconsistencies decreased. However, The personal cost increased. He began to lose track of time. Entire days were consumed by repetitive tasks, and the nights became fragmented, interrupted by awakenings for no apparent reason. Another subplot emerged when Margaret revealed something she had been avoiding mentioning. Many heirs didn't die in the house. They left, legally alive, but unable to resume their previous lives. Medical records indicated nervous breakdowns, severe anxiety, and rapid personal failures after leaving. The house didn't kill them, it emptied them. This pattern brought a new layer of tension. Staying didn't guarantee full survival, it only postponed deterioration. Leaving, on the other hand, seemed to exact an even higher price. Ethan began to understand that the Winchester legacy didn't operate through direct punishment, but through progressive attrition, like an invisible contract that slowly consumed those who accepted its terms. Meanwhile, a secondary figure gained relevance. Daniel Price Daniel, a representative of a real estate consortium interested in acquiring the land, came up with seemingly advantageous proposals, claiming that recent changes in legislation could allow for the partial sale of the property. His presence introduced a concrete temptation to close the deal in a practical and profitable way. However, conversations with Daniel were always followed by problems. After each meeting, areas of the house would simultaneously collapse. Old pipes would burst, staircases would suddenly develop structural failures, requiring immediate repairs. It was as if any attempt to transform the inheritance into external capital triggered a defensive reaction. Margaret realized this before Ethan did. She began to document the correlation between external proposals and internal failures. The pattern was too clear to be a coincidence. The house resisted conversion. It refused to be closed down, sold, or reduced to a financial asset. The relationship between Ethan and Margaret also changed. Professional distance gave way to a silent dependence. She was the only person who understood, at least in part, what was happening. However, this closeness generated tension. Margaret found herself torn between the academic desire to understand the house and the fear of becoming part of the same cycle of deterioration. The climax of the subplots occurred when Ethan found an old medical report hidden among legal documents. The report described recurring symptoms in heirs, loss of professional identity, difficulty making decisions outside the context of the household, a feeling of uselessness away from the property. It was the same pattern he was beginning to recognize in himself. The subplots no longer diverted attention from the main conflict. They compressed it. Every possibility of escape, adaptation, or alternative solution proved illusory. The house didn't need to prevent choices, it simply needed to make them unfeasible in the long term. In the end, Ethan understood that the complexity of the Winchester legacy lay not in its tortuous corridors, but in the way each attempt at simplification created new layers of dependency. The turning point didn't come with a visible collapse or an abrupt event. It manifested itself silently, almost administratively, like everything related to the Winchester inheritance. Ethan noticed the change while routinely reviewing the weekly reports required by the legal counsel. For the first time since taking over the property, there were no outstanding issues, notifications, or automatic corrections. The system was satisfied. This realization should have brought relief, but it had the opposite effect. The absence of pressure revealed something more disturbing. The house was no longer reacting because there was no need to react anymore. Ethan had learned to adjust. Confirmation came when he found a document he didn't remember writing. It was a detailed, precise maintenance plan for the next 5 years, predicting wear cycles and interventions in areas he hadn't yet thoroughly inspected. The style was technical, coherent, and perfectly consistent with his way of thinking. Yet he had no recollection of creating it. When comparing the plan to Thomas Winchester's notebooks, the similarity was undeniable, not only in the proposed actions, but in the underlying logic, not to control the house, only to ensure its continuity. Ethan wasn't being coerced. He was being molded. Margaret realized the gravity of the situation when Ethan began anticipating problems even before physical signs appeared. He knew which staircases would need reinforcement, which hallways should remain active, which areas shouldn't be touched for months. There was no mystical intuition in it, just an internalized pattern. The house no longer needed to communicate through faults or external pressures. Ethan had become the perfect mediator. The decisive event occurred when Charles Whitmore returned, a rare and unsolicited occurrence. He brought with him an addendum to the will, drafted decades earlier, but never enforced due to the lack of a suitable heir. The document made no mention of curses, spirits, or punishments. It merely stipulated that, after a certain period of absolute compliance, the person responsible for the property would cease to be classified as a temporary heir and would become a permanent heir. Permanent curator. In practice, this meant something simple and devastating. The inheritance ceased to be something Ethan possessed. It became something era. The position of guardian had no fixed term and could not be transferred by sale or resignation. Succession would only occur in case of proven incapacity or death. The financial fund would continue to exist, guaranteeing sufficient resources for the upkeep of the household, and nothing more. There would be no personal enrichment, nor freedom for prolonged absence. Whitmore explained everything with almost clinical neutrality. According to the records, the Winchesters had realized, over generations, that the greatest risk to the continuity of the house was not ghosts or legends, but heirs trying to end the cycle. The solution was legal, not supernatural. To create a system that identified, adapted, and fixed the ideal profile. Ethan tried to refuse. He formalized objections, questioned the legality, threatened to appeal to higher authorities. The responses were immediate, well-founded, and irrefutable. He himself had signed preparatory documents acknowledging standards and accepting terms. His resistance came too late. The most disturbing moment came when Margaret found a final detail in the files. Sarah Winchester had never been a prisoner in the house. She had been the first. Conscious healer, the incessant construction was not born of fear, but of a rational decision to maintain a system that thrived on continuous occupation. The house needed someone who wouldn't try to fully understand it, only to keep it functional. Ethan reacted with a cold clarity that startled Margaret. There was no emotional outburst, no visible despair, just a gradual, almost logical acceptance. He realized that all the previous alternatives, selling, fleeing, collapsing, were less sustainable than controlled permanence. The turning point solidified when Ethan signed the final curatorship agreement. In doing so, he didn't feel immediate loss. He felt alignment. The constant pressure completely disappeared. The house was stable. For the first time since his arrival, the hallways felt truly quiet. Margaret understood at that moment that the story wasn't about an ancient curse, but about something far more disturbing. A human system, efficient and patient, capable of transforming rational individuals into permanent cogs in a machine designed to never stop. And what was most unsettling was realizing that Ethan had not been defeated. He had been chosen. The consequences of signing the contract weren't immediate or dramatic. There were no abrupt changes to Ethan's routine, nor any physical transformations to the house. The impact was more subtle, and for that very reason, more profound. The absence of conflict became the first sign that something had shifted irreversibly. Ethan began to be treated differently by the systems that had previously pressured him. Legal notices ceased entirely. Reports were simply filed away, no longer evaluated. The financial fund, previously contingent on a series of requirements, became predictable, almost automatic. The house no longer demanded proof of commitment. It already possessed it. Ethan's initial reaction was to rationalize. He convinced himself that he had assumed a stable, albeit unusual, administrative role. He wasn't a prisoner, just responsible. However, small changes in behavior began to emerge. He stopped recording everything in writing. He trusted decisions made immediately, without the need for verification. External logic, once essential, became secondary to an internal understanding of how the household functioned. Margaret was the first to notice the distance. Ethan remained polite and approachable, but less interested in sharing doubts or hypotheses. He no longer needed them. When Margaret suggested new lines of research or raised historical questions, he listened attentively, but responded with short sentences, ending the subject without conflict. The house was no longer an object of study for him. It was an operating system. External reactions also began to change. Former creditors withdrew outstanding debts without clear explanation. Invitations for jobs or projects gradually disappeared, not due to explicit rejection, but due to a lack of response. Ethan ceased to be considered available. His name remained active, but immobilized, like a contact that no one else tries to reach. The most disturbing consequence arose when he tried to leave on his own initiative. He planned a short trip, just 2 days away from the property, with no apparent legal need. He prepared everything in advance, delegated basic tasks, and left clear reports. On the morning of his departure, an unexpected structural flaw appeared in a sensitive wing of the house. Nothing serious, but enough to require immediate attention. Ethan cancelled the trip without hesitation, as if he had never considered leaving. This automatic reaction bothered him for a few moments, and then it stopped bothering him. The house didn't prevent him from leaving. It simply created situations where staying was always the most efficient decision. Margaret, on the other hand, reacted with growing unease. She realized that her presence there was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Not out of hostility, but out of futility. Her discoveries no longer altered the course of events. The house no longer needed to be understood. It only needed to be maintained. The estrangement between the two intensified when Margaret suggested directly that Ethan step down as curator while he still could. His response was calm, almost neutral. He explained that there was no "while he still could." There was only the continuity of the system. He showed neither fear nor resignation, only consistency. This response marked a definitive break. Margaret realized that insisting would be useless. She wasn't losing Ethan to the house through violence, but to something far more difficult to combat: logical acceptance. The final consequences began to be reflected in the very dynamics of the place. The house was more stable than ever before. The faults decreased drastically. The critical areas remained active without the need for constant intervention. It was as if the structure had found its ideal equilibrium. Ethan, for his part, began to experience a peculiar form of satisfaction. Not joy nor pride, but adequacy. He no longer saw himself as someone who lived there temporarily. The idea of a future ceased to exist outside those corridors. The quietest and most definitive reaction was the absence of internal conflict. The moral dilemma, the initial anguish, the need to escape, all dissolved. The system had fulfilled its purpose not by breaking it, but by aligning it perfectly. And at that point, any attempt to return to one's previous life would no longer make sense, not because it was impossible, but because it would be inefficient. Ethan's transformation didn't occur as a personal victory, nor as an emotional breakdown. It manifested as a progressive, almost imperceptible adjustment between who he had been and the role he now played. The growth wasn't about escaping the Winchester house, but about learning to operate within its limits without destroying himself, at least not immediately. The first new challenge arose when a series of minor failures began to repeat themselves in different areas, something that hadn't happened since Ethan took over as curator. These weren't structural collapses, but signs of imbalance, staircases requiring reinforcement outside of the planned cycle, corridors that began to cool down irregularly again, small cracks in walls that had recently been stabilized. The house wasn't in crisis, it was being tested. Unlike before, Ethan didn't react with excessive effort or anxiety. He observed. He cross-referenced old data, comparing it with records that now seemed all too familiar. He realized the pattern wasn't in the architecture, but in himself. His adaptation had been too efficient. The house needed minimal stress to remain active. A perfectly stable system was becoming vulnerable. This realization marked a new stage of growth. Ethan began to introduce controlled variations. He delayed minor repairs, kept areas in use longer than necessary, and allowed calculated wear and tear before intervening. Not out of negligence, but out of understanding. The house didn't demand perfection. It demanded dynamic continuity. This change was also reflected in his personal behavior. Ethan re-established minimal external routines, not to escape, but to maintain a sense of belonging. Occasional visits to the city, brief meetings with suppliers, functional contacts that ensured he still existed outside the property. Each departure was planned as part of the balance, not as a threat to the curatorship. The greatest proof of growth came when Daniel Price returned with a new, more aggressive and legally sophisticated proposal. Instead of reacting defensively or avoiding contact, Ethan conducted the negotiation with technical coolness. He neither promised a sale nor refused immediately. He used external interest as a controlled stimulus. In the days following the meetings, small flaws emerged, predictable, manageable. The firm reacted, but without collapsing. Ethan had learned to use pressure as a tool. Margaret, who had distanced herself, returned on her own initiative after noticing changes in the public records of the property. She found a different Ethan from the one she had left months before. No longer the conflicted man, nor the passive caretaker, he moved through the house naturally, making quick decisions, but without rigidity. There was still humanity there, albeit reorganized. The reunion was tense but revealing. Ethan didn't try to convince Margaret of anything. He simply explained, objectively, that the house didn't need to be fought or completely deciphered. It needed to be managed with awareness of the human costs involved. He recognized the price he was paying and accepted paying it actively, not submissively. Margaret realized with discomfort that this was the first heir who hadn't been consumed or destroyed quickly. He had grown up within the system, adapting without completely losing his autonomy. This didn't make the situation any less macabre. It made it more efficient. The final challenge of this stage arose when Ethan found an old, recently updated medical file assessing his cognitive and emotional capacity. The report classified him as fully fit, but indicated future risks of progressive dissociation, the same pattern observed in previous caregivers after decades of service. For the first time, the system recognized limits. Instead of ignoring the warning, Ethan acted. He created personal protocols, periodic memory logs, documented decisions even when not required, regular contact with someone outside the household dynamics, Margaret against his initial wishes, not to seek help but to preserve contrast. That was the real growth. Ethan didn't break free from the Winchester legacy. He learned to coexist with it, without disappearing completely. He transformed curating into a conscious, not automatic role. The overcoming wasn't heroic, it was strategic. He didn't conquer the house, nor was he conquered by it. He found a middle ground, fragile, unstable, but functional. And in that precarious balance, Ethan understood something essential. The curse of the Winchester legacy wasn't in imprisoning people, but in offering a form of belonging so efficient that resisting it required constant effort. Growing up there didn't mean escaping. It meant remembering every day that there was still something to lose. The equilibrium built by Ethan began to show signs of exhaustion when external factors started to converge simultaneously. There wasn't an isolated failure, but a subtle acceleration of events, as if the system, after years of adaptation, was heading towards an inevitable point of definition. The first sign came from the financial fund. For the first time since taking on the curatorship, Ethan received a notice of an extraordinary audit. It wasn't about irregularities, but a long-term structural review. The legal counsel wanted to assess the sustainability of the curatorship over the next few decades. The tone was neutral, but the content indicated something bigger, the possibility of a transition. Almost simultaneously, Margaret made a disturbing discovery. In recently released university archives, she found internal Winchester correspondence that had never been incorporated into the official collection. The letters described a rare event mentioned only as functional closure. This did not signify the end of the house, but the definitive consolidation of the system, the moment when a curator ceased to be merely human and began to operate as a full extension of the structure. Reports indicated that this stage only occurred when three conditions aligned: prolonged stability, absence of active resistance, and institutional recognition of the curatorship as irreversible. All of these were forming around Ethan. The house began to react differently. There were no failures or collapses. There was anticipation. Areas that used to require maintenance became stable without intervention. Others, considered secondary, began to demand urgent attention, as if the system were reorganizing priorities for a larger event. The pace accelerated, compressing decisions that could previously be postponed. Ethan realized that his own preservation protocols were being tested. Memory records showed gaps. Documented decisions seemed too obvious upon rereading, as if he had made them not by choice, but by unavoidable logical necessity. The contrast he had struggled to maintain was beginning to disappear. The build-up to the climax intensified when the board announced an in-person visit, something that hadn't happened in decades. The inspection had no stated purpose beyond a final compliance assessment. The bureaucratic language concealed a simple truth. The system was poised to either validate or reject Ethan as the definitive solution. Margaret insisted that this was the last possible moment of rupture. She no longer spoke of fleeing or destroying the house. She spoke of a conscious choice. To remain now meant accepting an irreversible transformation. Leaving, even with severe losses, would still preserve something essential. Ethan listened without interrupting. For the first time in a long time, he didn't respond immediately. He felt the pressure differently, not as a threat, but as a constraint. The system wasn't pushing him anymore. It was only moving forward. In the days leading up to the visit, the house was utterly silent. No creaks, no drafts, no doors dislodging. It was the stillness of something that no longer needed testing. This silence was more unsettling than any previous instability. Ethan revisited areas he hadn't been to in months. Forgotten hallways, useless staircases, doors that led to walls. Everything was intact, functional within its own logic. For the first time, he realized he knew the house not as a space, but as an ongoing process, and that process was about to be completed. On the eve of the inspection, Ethan found one last document, recently added to the central files. It had no signature, only a title, Full Business Continuity Protocol. The text described in technical terms the final transfer of decision-making responsibility from the curator to the system, a stage in which human presence became permanent, but autonomy was almost completely diluted. The preparations were complete. There were no more adjustments possible, only final choices. The tension didn't come from what could go wrong, but from what was about to go too right. Ethan understood, with uneasy clarity, that the climax would not be a violent confrontation or a shocking revelation. It would be the moment when he would decide if he still existed, outside from the house, or just within, that is. The inspection began at dawn, without ceremony. 3 representatives from the legal council arrived in discreet vehicles, accompanied by specialized technicians who didn't ask unnecessary questions. There was no explicit tension in the air, only efficiency. The house seemed prepared to receive them, as if every corridor was aware of the route that would be taken. Ethan led the group with precision. There was no hesitation, no need to consult maps or notes. He anticipated every detour, every sensitive area, every point requiring technical explanation. The inspectors recorded everything with silent attention. No mistakes were pointed out, no inconsistencies were found. The climax didn't arise from a mistake, but from a confirmation. During the final evaluation, one of the representatives requested access to the oldest wing, a sector rarely included in formal inspections. Ethan knew that this request was not random. It was the ultimate test. He led the group to the location without question, aware that this area represented the core of the system. The environment was intact, functional within its absurd logic. Stairs ended in closed ceilings, doors opened onto walls, corridors led to spaces that served no practical purpose. Yet everything was stable, nothing required repair. The lead representative presented the final document. There was no speech, just the objective confirmation that all conditions had been met. The system was ready to move on to the final stage. That's when the turning point occurred. Ethan interrupted the procedure. For the first time since taking over the curatorship, he refused to follow the expected course of action. There was no emotional outburst, no dramatic speech, just a precise decision. He requested the temporary suspension of the full continuity protocol based on a forgotten clause, an exception provided for situations of systemic human risk. The representatives hesitated. The clause existed, but it had never been triggered. Ethan explained with technical clarity. The system was too stable. The complete absence of failures indicated excessive dependence on a single operator. Full continuity at that point would create an irreversible critical failure point. It was an argument that stemmed not from fear, but from the logic of the system itself. The silence that followed didn't come from the inspectors, but from within the building. An almost imperceptible pressure ran through the corridors. There was no collapse, but a clear reaction to the unexpected interruption. For the first time in years, the structure hadn't anticipated the decision. The board demanded a practical justification. Ethan presented it. He had prepared an alternative plan for distributed succession, a model in which trusteeship would be shared, rotating, and time-limited. It wouldn't shut down the system, but it would prevent the complete absorption of a single individual. This proposal had never been considered viable. The Winchesters had dismissed the idea as less efficient. Ethan recognized this and used it against the system itself. Absolute efficiency created absolute fragility. The reaction was immediate. Malfunctions began to appear in specific areas of the house, not chaotically, but deliberately. The system was testing the proposal. Ethan responded calmly, activating previously prepared protocols. He wasn't reacting to the house. He was dialoguing with it in its own language, actions and consequences. Margaret, who was watching from a distance, perceived the exact moment of transformation. Ethan wasn't running away or submitting. I was redefining the terms. The climax was reached when the board accepted the provisional suspension of the protocol, not out of ethical conviction, but due to technical feasibility. The system needed adjusting. For the first time since its creation, the Winchester legacy faced a real structural change. The house didn't collapse, nor did it remain unchanged. It adapted slowly, as it always had. Ethan felt the impact immediately. The constant pressure disappeared, replaced by something different, shared responsibility. The risk hadn't been eliminated, but redistributed. The twist didn't destroy the house or completely free Ethan, but it broke the most dangerous cycle, that of total absorption. At the final moment of the inspection, As he signed the suspension form, Ethan realized something essential. The curse had never been inevitable. It had simply been too efficient to be questioned. And by questioning it on the only point the system respected, its own logic, he had created something new, not complete freedom, but choose. The suspension of the protocol brought no celebration or sense of victory. What followed was a period of slow, almost imperceptible adjustment, in which the Winchester Club had to relearn how to operate without a single central human axis. The consequences spread gradually, like controlled waves. The legal council formalized the new distributed curatorship model. Additional technicians were integrated, each with defined responsibilities and deadlines. None of them stayed long enough to be absorbed by the system. The firm reacted with minor initial instabilities, but without collapses. Operational costs increased, efficiency decreased, and, for the first time, this was considered acceptable. Ethan remained the primary curator, but not the absolute one. His role shifted from constant executor to strategic mediator. He no longer needed to anticipate every reaction from the house. He could make mistakes within limits. He could be absent for short periods without everything requiring immediate correction. This margin of imperfection was the biggest sign of change. The personal consequences were ambiguous. Ethan didn't recover the life he had before, nor did he try. Chicago, his old job, his lost marriage, all of that belonged to a time that no longer made sense to rebuild. Still, he began to exist again outside the tortuous corridors. Small choices reappeared. When to go out, who to talk to, what to delegate. Margaret followed this process from a distance, resuming her research with a different approach. The house was no longer just a historical or architectural study. It had become an extreme example of how systems designed to last can consume people when they lack clear human boundaries. Her records began to focus less on the Winchesters and more on the structures they had created. The house, in turn, continued. There was no symbolic closure nor cathartic destruction. The stairs leading to nowhere still existed. The useless doors remained where they had always been. The environment remained illogical, but functional within its new parameters. The difference lay in the absence of constant urgency. In the long run, the Winchester legacy lost some of its legendary character. Without isolated heirs, without unexplained collapses, without stories of disappearances, the place became merely strange and no longer devouring. This didn't mean it was safe, only that it no longer demanded absolute sacrifices. Ethan understood belatedly that the true curse had never been the house itself, but the idea that something needs to function perfectly to deserve continued existence. By introducing deliberate human flaws, he had broken the most dangerous mechanism of all. The conclusion brought neither complete redemption nor exemplary punishment. It brought something rarer in that context, a final state consistent with the entire journey. The house remained, Ethan too, but neither of them ever went back to being what they were before. Years later, occasional visitors toured the Winchester house, guided by technicians who took turns with calculated precision. The aimless staircases and useless doors remained, preserved not as a mystery, but as a silent warning. Ethan rarely appeared. When he did, he walked through the corridors like someone who knew a place without needing to dominate it. He didn't give orders. He didn't supervise closely. He simply observed. In one of her final writings, Margaret stated that the house had not been tamed, only understood within its human limitations. The system continued to exist, but now with something it had never had before: room for failure. And that's precisely why we should continue. The story of the Winchester legacy doesn't end in the winding corridors of that house, but in the choices each reader recognizes outside of it. Systems, structures, and decisions that promise absolute security often exact a silent price, too human to be ignored. If this story provoked unease, reflection, or identification, Share your reading with someone who also questions what it means to persevere at any cost. Leave your comment. At what point would you have made a different choice? Would you have accepted perfect efficiency or risked imperfection? His perspective broadens this narrative, and perhaps it will prevent other invisible houses from continuing to operate without being questioned.